I'm Rob Waddell. I'm in the history department here at the University of Rhode Island. I'm with David Gass, who I'll let introduce himself, but this is another of our continuing interviews in the series looking and talking with folks that were involved in both Freedom Summer and other activities in and around Mississippi and in the South and during the Civil Rights Movement. So, David, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm David Gass, and I'm from Lynn, Massachusetts, a city in Lynn, in Massachusetts, and I went off to college in 1962 from Moses Brown School, which is a Quaker school in Providence, to a co-op school called Antioch College in Southern Ohio, probably 30 minutes from where the youth met before they went to Mississippi. And I had been brought up, my father had been, as a Jewish family, part of a Jewish family in Russia during the revolution. And he became an aide to the revolution when he was a little kid, sending messages. And he got the sense of justice and injustice because his village would be destroyed by Cossacks, etc. And he came here in the 1920s, and he infused in our family the idea of fighting for justice. And growing up, I felt that way, but had no way to deal with it because our city was probably all-white city. Now it's a majority-minority city. But I went away to college, and I got involved in 1963 in a sit-down. It blocked the highway in Southern Ohio, which is where the Klan originated in the 1920s, right in that area, Fairborn, Ohio. And we were protesting the fact that a white barber would not cut the hair of a black person. And so that was my first time with tear gas and all that. I got the feeling of that there was a fight going on in the country. And a friend said, let's go to Mississippi. I said, why? He said, in the summer, in June of '64. He said, because there was about 1,000 people in this Jackson County fairgrounds that had been arrested. Mostly the white students that went down from the north to vote for voter registration, and they need replacements. So I said, well, okay, we drove to Mississippi and went to Jackson and was assigned to West Point, Mississippi. It's north of Tupelo, in the northeast corner of Mississippi. And it was probably the second experience I had with the level of poverty there. I had been in the coal mining area of Kentucky. I visited and helped the coal miners one time. But this was completely different because you had a visible enemy that would chase you around. So we were assigned to work with to work at a freedom school, which was set up, and to get books together and work in the office at a little ditto machine that had, you get the ink all over yourself. It's nothing like what they have today. And our school was functioning up and running, and then one night it was burned. And we had a rally of the neighbors, the freedom singers came and, ain't scared of your jail because I want my freedom, and they taught us all these songs that were just wonderful songs, really good songs. And an old little lady with a sharecropper hat gets up and says, I want 10 men and none of you crippled, get your guns. We're going to form a Deacons for Defense and Justice. We're going to protect our school. And that's what what impressed me was that people, the poorest, most downtrodden people in the country were willing to die or sacrifice everything they had, their job, their home, for the right to vote and for freedom. And it impressed me, and I was there probably only 2 or 3 weeks, and what was growing in the civil rights movement was the notion that the whites should go back to the north and work in poor white neighborhoods. And that was always the split in the SNCC. But so after about 3 or 4 weeks, I went up to join an SCS project. It was called ERAP, E-R-A-P, in Trenton, New Jersey. And we worked in the black community. We did a study of the housing situation. And by the end of the summer, we marched people down to City Hall to demand better housing. That was my experience there. And then I worked at a school in Philadelphia, Miss Penny's Peace School, where we went around to teach. We used dolls like Mary McLeod Bethune, Gandhi, King, and went to teach peace in the black community. And at the same time, I was reading a book by Robert Williams called Negroes with Guns. So I was split between the self-defense concept and the nonviolent strategy. Went from there to work in the anti-war movement. I stayed in Ohio. I went up to Cleveland, Ohio, and I joined a group called Youth Against War and Fascism, which was an anti-war group. And I was married then, and I worked in the unions. We organized anti-war marches. In 1968, we shut down a George Wallace rally at Public Hall, and about 800 of us, they tear gassed us, they beat me up and dragged me away, charged me with riot. And we mobilized the community, got the charges dropped. And I was involved in many things there, including I was in Kent State the day before the shootings with the family, and people the fellow who held the girl when she died came running to my house and said they're after us, and so we hid them and helped them. We shut down Case Western Reserve University by blocking Euclid Avenue, the main street. And when the police came in the horses, we knew from those sort of nonviolent tactics not to to stay in the streets. We said, get up. And we retreated and we took over the campus, and that was in the early 70s. And you have to remember that the student movement, which was the only viable student movement in the history of the United States, unlike Japan and other countries, was fueled by the civil rights movement. And a lot of us were trained by these tactics in the South. And then when the black movement, the civil rights movement itself, was crushed by the government, whether they shot people or arrested people or whatever they did, the student movement also died in 1970 after the shootings at Kent State. Couldn't get the students to do much of anything. And then I was in the labor movement for about 10 years. I carried these ideas over to organize people, and the power has to come from the grassroots, because all the major reforms in this country have been done by outside the system, putting pressure on politicians, saying this is what we want, this is what we want, and having enough people to demand it. And such as Social Security, 8-hour workday, all these things, free speech, you go back to the Wobblies, all these things that I was working on. But after a major strike at our plant, and I was a union official, the plant closed, and I got a history degree and wrote a thesis on the history of abolitionism in Northeast Ohio, because that was the second largest abolitionist movement in the country next to Massachusetts. It was in Northeast Ohio. And then I moved back to Lynn to build houses. My father built about 40 houses, subdivisions, and then I said, this is it, I want to build affordable housing, and I built housing in Boston. And lately, in the last few years, I've worked at a school building an organization. It's called the Highlands Coalition, and it's in a neighborhood where 95% of the kids get free food, and 3/4 of the people, maybe 80%, are communities of color, whether it's Cambodian, Hispanic, or black. And we teach the same values, trying to teach and tell people how you got to empower yourself and you can make change. And I live in a city that is the third majority city in Massachusetts. But the problem is that City Hall is 90% white. And what struck me the most was going to an MLK breakfast about 5 years ago with 400 people at the college, sitting next to a man who was been a black firefighter for 28 years. He said, guess what? We just won a case in federal court about opening up the firefighters. I said, why? He said, because 75 have been hired in the last 15 years, 6 Hispanics and no blacks. And the judge ruled in our favor against the mayor. And he said to us, how about the police department? And I said, well, why aren't you telling this story to the audience here? Because they don't want me, because this group happens to be the civil rights group in the city, is paid by the city hall a certain amount of money to keep going, and they don't want that known. So instead of going to MLK breakfast, I said, our group form what to call an equal rights forum. Every year, the group's working on equal rights issue, whether it's economic equality, gender equality, or ethnic equality, and tell us what you did last year and what you can do next year for equality of various types. And that we have every year. So the idea is to carry all these things that I learned from this woman who said, let's defend ourselves, to the people who were ready to die for voting, essentially. And I think that is what I carry with me my entire life. Did that answer your question?
So I mean, there's a lot to unpack, you know, in there, and you've been involved in so many things that have grown out of your involvement in the movement and your work in Mississippi. I'm curious. You know, so your father was a very big influence on you in terms of. Mm-hmm. You know, had you and you said you went to Kentucky as a high school student?
Yeah, as a high school and a freshman in college, there was a strike of coal miners in eastern Kentucky, Hazard, Kentucky, and we went and raised funds for that and sent clothing. And then when I went back to school, I formed a group supporting miners. We went down there and got a tour of the of Hazard, Kentucky coal mines and what was going on there.
So was that for you sort of your first entree into sort of activism, or had you just from the very from very young age been involved in different efforts, or was this?
That was my first real, because there was nothing in the city of Lynn. There was really nothing. There was a General Electric plant that had probably the strongest, most progressive union in New England, and but other than General Electric, there was nothing happening in the city of Lynn. But ideas were carried over from my father and my uncles, and telling stories about what happened to them in Russia. And of course, the family was lost when Hitler invaded the area. Nothing was heard. So, and those I'd read about the Holocaust. But nothing was in the Holocaust said how did Hitler come to power? Because it was given over, the history, and it was because people did not resist on the ballot. He won by an electoral vote. Essentially, it turned over to him. But when I heard that the people were demonstrating and saw the pictures of the dogs, attacking the young people, my peers, really. I said something should be done, and that carried over.
So yeah, I was going to ask you. So how you decided upon or were drawn into doing Black freedom struggle, civil rights kind of work as where you would direct your energy when you decided to get involved in movement activity.
Well, that was the only thing happened. Early '60s, there was not a very beginning of an anti-war movement. Only the Quakers were picketing, and it was silent protests, And the only thing that was really fighting for in this country was in the civil rights in the South. Not even in the North was there much. So, like I said, my parents had been involved radically in the labor movement, and that influenced me. But I went to a Quaker school, which was very conservative, then went out to Antioch. When you get to Antioch, it's 101 picketing, 102 protests, so you couldn't. And right away, we picked a target, which was a barber shop, the only place in town, because Antioch was founded by Robert Owen's community, Yellow Springs, and was founded by Horace Mann. Okay, as one of the first integrated colleges in the country, so it's very liberal. But when I got there and I found out that it wasn't so liberal to its workers, my wife and I organized a labor union of the college workers, about 100 people. They were only getting less than $1 an hour, and we struck the day before graduation. So that's when I left the college and went to Cleveland. But I was always, my feeling was always feeling of, had to extend what happens to all the immigrant groups, whether it's the Germans, the Irish, the Jews, to other groups coming into the country. So that was my feeling. As a matter of fact, the first meeting of Hispanics was at our house in the late 60s. There were 10 Hispanic people in Lynn. Now there's 40,000. So that was the feeling that I was encouraged to do that. My brother became a doctor, and he worked as an alternative service Apache Indian reservation, and that was his contribution.
So then you went to Mississippi. Did you said in for the first time in 64?
64, the first and last time. Yeah.
And if I'm remembering correctly, it was just someone just approached you and said, there's stuff going on in Mississippi, or and we need to go, or so sort of impromptu, or was it?
Two people got up and spoke at meetings at Antioch before then. One was Larry Rubin, who has become a well-known person and stayed there for a number of years, and still today represents unions. And Joni Rabinowitz. The two had been in the South, and they reported back on what it was like at hundreds of people at the college. So I got a sense of what it was like, but I didn't know how to tie it into my life. And then there was a sit down at the in the tear gas. We were tear gassed for no reason. Well, we were blocking the street. What else would you do? Divert the cars? I mean, so and there was a Klan member that ran the barber shop, as it turns out. So we began to learn about that, and then when 200 people were arrested, they were marched to the jail, and the liberal dean of the college said, "You can't picket, you're going to get expelled." And we marched, 700 people marched. We joined with Central State students and Wilberforce students, and we had a mass march. So I learned that really the change comes, can come from the bottom. It's not just someone giving you something, but something you work for.
So then, they before you went down, did you go through SNCC's training and that kind of thing, or did you just sort of jump in the car and show up in Mississippi?
My friend Ben said, Ben Ovshinsky, his father he was a designer of the electric car, very inventive guy. The first car to go from Boston to New York on one fill. That was Ben Ovshinsky's father, very inventive guy. His son was very inventive. And Ben said, let's go. So jumped in plane, jumped and got into Mississippi. And as soon as we got in there, cops stopped us and said, "Welcome to Mississippi. This is the 100th anniversary of something or other. You stop and have a Coke." And we said, no, thanks, we're going. They didn't want to tell them we had Ohio plates. And then let's join we heard about what was going on, that they were spraying the kids that they had arrested in the county. I think it was the Jackson County Fairground. They kept them in the morning. Even pregnant women, they said, were sprayed with DDT. I mean, it's just terrible. They were treating them badly, and they needed volunteers. And so I didn't think of the danger. And then the 3 men who were killed were in the ground. I went to school with David, with Goodman's brother, David Goodman, and with Schwerner's brother was the dean of the college later on, so I met him. And it got very, very personal, but we were chased around, but the warmth there was incredible from the people. The fear was there, but people will welcome you and say thank you, basically, especially young people wanted to change.
So walk me through that a little bit, because you show up and you're greeted and you're trying to get away from them. So where did you go when you first got to Mississippi? Did you have someone that you were trying to find to connect up with, or how did you go about enmeshing yourself in some of the stuff that you ended up doing?
We went to Jackson, and there was, I guess they call it a COFO. It was an office there, and we were told what's oriented, and then we said we were assigned to go to West Point. And we got a little tour around Jackson, but and we were told, stay in the black neighborhood, the white neighborhood, you're going to be very suspect. And then we went up to West Point and got to the office there, and there was rooms in the back to stay. It got to be so hot. Part of the reason I left was so hot. I could take as much cold as you give me, but heat I can't. but it was very hot, and I don't remember that much about it. I kind of blocked it out because there's so many other things that happened to me in that period. Many things that were far more violent, being in the middle of the Glenville riot in Cleveland and having friends get shot and things like that, and being in the middle of an anti-Nazi march in Cleveland where we busted up a Nazi group. There was a lot of things going on that were much more powerful image than in Mississippi for me. But that was where I learned that the people there are good people and need some help getting organized. Not to take away their power, but to give them more power. And that's what I carried my whole life. So we met Cleveland Sellers, we met people who gave talks about what they were doing, and that was, and then the move was go up in north and organize. We have enough people here, so I left.
So how long were you in Mississippi?
I think it's about 3 or 4 weeks at the most.
Yeah.
In July of '64.
July of 64.
By August, I was working in the slum of Trenton, New Jersey, where Tom Hayden was working in Newark, and he organized some incredible things. We were in Trenton, New Jersey. So that was, and what we learned to do first is you got to get the facts first. You got to be as scientific as possible. You get the facts. What are people earning, or what's their rent? What are their living conditions? Don't just get subjective stories. Find out this and put it all together, and then you can determine, because a lot of problems come from economics. People will want to vote. Why do you want to vote in Mississippi? Because the county commissioner will determine how much crop I can grow. It wasn't just to vote for a candidate, but it was voting to keep some food on your table. So voting was power, more power than we can imagine. And you have to do it. So I tell the young people, let's look at the facts. How are people living? If they're comfortable, they'll act one way. If they're not unhappy, find out why. Find out the level of the problem. And that's what I learned in the labor movement too. You got to find out the wages, the working conditions before you even start to organize.
So, you were then in Trenton for how long were you there for?
It was probably a month, 4, 5, 6 weeks or something like that.
And then it was back to Antioch.
Yeah, back to Antioch. Yeah.
And then from there to Cleveland.
And then went to Cleveland. Yeah, we had, and I was in a group called Youth Against War and Fascism, which was a Marxist organization. They call themselves Trotskyists, but I was never a Trotskyist. I didn't want to go backwards in time, but I liked them because they would go to demonstration. They weren't afraid of chanting and being strong, and if we were messed with, we could break up with opposition. So that was my goal, and they were a little stronger than the most groups, but they were interested in being public about their opinions. And we worked with GIs. I got busted once for handing out a GI newspaper called The Bond. The fellow who ran it, Andy Stapp, just died last 2 weeks ago, who organized a union in the Army on all the bases. So we sent out an anti-war newspaper to all the bases in the world, and they busted me at the airport. And so that was kind of routine. You expected that to happen.
So one of the things that I'm curious about is, in the midst of doing all this, we often hear stories about folks who've been active, and then they go out, they get married, they have children, they settle down, they get they have other concerns that go on. But it sounds like your trajectory was just never in that. So did you ever have a moment in there when you thought, I'm getting worn down, I don't know how much I can continue to do this, or was it, how were you able to keep yourself refreshed. And active in all the things you were doing?
If you're part of a group that's really a very political group, has an agenda, then you can do it. If you're on your own, it's difficult. But in the early 70s, we marched down with 1,000 people into an anti-war march against Spiro Agnew. And my wife we had a child, and we had an effigy of Nixon, and we threw a rope around a tree down in Public Square, and we burned the effigy, and the cops chased us. My wife said, "That's it. You got a kid now. you got to be more civilized. Can't get busted." So that backed me off a little bit, but it was always get refreshed by some victory. You can't keep beating your head against the wall. You have to have some victory. At the end of the labor movement period, and I had 10 years in the shop organizing. Plant closed, everything dissolved. I came back to build houses, so that was refreshing to me, to go into another field to build houses for people, and then to work with nonprofits, which I've done for probably 15 years now, to build first, to take something and make it into something new, develop. We took a building in the worst area in Lynn and got some money from the government, formed a CDC, Community Development Corporation, and we built out 10 units of housing and business in the worst area to turn around that building, that area. And then we planted trees, and 60 trees. It led me up to a school where the principal said, "Come on in, I want a community school here." I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, a community school works with adult education. It works with a community group to solve social problems." I said, "Fine, we'll deal with the social problems and you educate the kids." So we built a garden there, a community garden on Hot Top, the first one in Massachusetts about 6 years ago. And we grow vegetables. The kids come out and learn nutrition. And it's a pathway out of poverty, which is just what voting is. It's the same thing. And half of the kids are overweight or obese because they eat USDA food twice a day, and it's all full of fat, sugar, and salt, even though it's improved a little bit. And we get the kids, teach them, how many have diabetes in your family? And half of them raise their hand. Well, it comes from the food you eat and lack of exercise. What are you doing? You know. And so that invigorates me because you're working with children, and they really want to know how things can change. Because when we opened the garden, a woman had just been murdered, and we were able to take her 4 children who adopted, and we were able to bring them into the garden to heal because they were growing food. We got them an apartment across the street, and we brought them into that. We were able to close drug houses because of the garden. So you have to refresh yourself with some victories. You just can't keep on yelling and yelling and yelling. You get sore throat from that.
Where were you working when you were in the shop with doing organizing? Where were you?
I was working in a place called Warner and Swayze, which is a big machine tool company, and the shop was setting up jig mills, milling machines.
And what union was it that you were?
IAM, Machinist Union. It was when Winpersinger was elected. He was from Cleveland, and he said when he got elected president of the union, million-person union, they're going to be changes around here. By the way, I'm a socialist. No, you're not a socialist at all. There was a kind of, the union was dissolving because all the jobs were being moved overseas like ours was, and he didn't protect the people. He just talked. And we had a pretty little violent strike, which we led, and they tried to fire me, and I got the job back. So, but I learned how to make things, which is what I always wanted to do with metal, and then how to work in the unions with the discipline you need, because if you're not disciplined, you're not going to get anywhere with your ideals at all. And then I went from there to building houses and worked as a carpenter for a number of years, framing carpenter and finish carpenter. So that was my experience, and then tried to pass it on to my kids. I took them every picket line I could, but they wound up, one went to URI, as a matter of fact, 20 years ago I graduated. And they didn't follow that because the generation was not going that direction. And I think that's important. The kids, by the time they get to be teenagers or in college, they follow the generation. Like you had a march last week, 2 weeks ago, of 300,000 people in New York. Half of them were college kids or younger. At least half. That's what's happening.
The climate change.
The climate change, yeah. And if Obama does not and Democrats could win the election if they raised that issue in a strong way. They could win the election because he was elected with 55% of the electorate. It's not even 55% of the voters, potential voters. And those were young people, those were minorities and women voted and made the difference between his and Kerry's loss. And he's losing those people because he's not listening to them. So that's my spiel for the moment.
So, we don't have a whole lot of time to follow up, although there's a lot there that would be really interesting and worth following up on. So, hopefully we have a chance to talk later and maybe do an extended interview later as well. One thing that I do want to ask, and maybe this is a way of concluding, at least for now, some of this is, as someone who was active, through all of these years, for the last 50 years, was there a moment for you when you sensed that the environment in which you were organizing had shifted in some palpable ways? And we often think about, and you speak about, the generations, right? So, we associate with the 60s and the 1970s as things going on, and then, things change. Was that something that you experienced in your work?
Definitely, especially during the Reagan years. It was very tough after he crushed the flight controllers strike. Very quiet. They had the Central American, the Contras, etc. That really cooled things off, and it was small groups were really fighting those battles. And in the 90s, I was I went to work as a carpenter. There was very little happening, and then I joined what's happened is lately, and there are periods like that. You have to go with the way the wind is going, because we lost a whole generation to Reagan, the Reagan children. Like my kids might be called the Reagan children because they weren't involved in much as far as progressive politics. But what's happened now is 5 years ago there was, I think, a march, a May Day march by the Hispanic, maybe 1 million Hispanics, and I'm working with a lot of Hispanics. And my son married a girl from Ecuador, and my other son married a girl from Taiwan. Now I'm really thinking what the civil rights movement has done to allow these folks to come here and to feel free and to raise children who are from mixed background. And it's going to be really important to me to fight, to continue this fight. The second thing is I'm working in the garden. I have a group from the Congo, 75 families from the Congo, West Africa, French-speaking, that said, can we have some of the land, it's about 5 times bigger than this room, 6 times bigger than this room. Could we have half your garden to plant? And they come over, and these are folks who faced 1 million people died in the Congo. They have stories to tell. One of them was a child soldier. So all these new stories are coming in that are exactly the same as my family's story, exactly the same. And I talk with, so that kind of invigorates me because there's a movement that can happen again. But there are times, dead times, where you can't force it. You can't get out there and keep on picketing. You probably wind up in taking Prozac or something like that, But I think that's, you have to go with the youth, but pass on the ideas and to the people. And the news stories, I got a grant $10,000 grant from Mass Humanities to study. And they said, what are you going to study? Well, first of all, we had Frederick Douglass went from slavery to talk at Nantucket at the Lyceum, hosted by a woman who was a scientist. Was it Mariah Mitchell, who came to Lynn with Frederick Douglass. And so every July 3rd, we read his speech from 1852, should the Negro support the Declaration of Independence.
What to the slave is the 4th of July.
Right, yeah. We do that we have 100, 200 people. And from that, we applied for a grant. Mass Humanities sponsored it. It said, what's next? I said, let's do a thing on immigration, assimilation. So we got a $10,000 grant to interview 19 people from different parts of the world that came to the city, going back 100 years, you know, English, whatever, Irish. Why did you come here? Are you assimilating, or are you trying to keep your culture going? And we produce a documentary from that. And that's really what invigorates you. Try different methods. It's not as like what happened in the civil rights movement. It's certainly not going to change a lot of policy, but that keeps people educated at a time when movement is kind of quiet and people are not that progressive. They're thinking about consumer. What can I, you know, people are losing ground financially. And that you always have to keep in mind is, where are people at financially? Well, in our community, 50% of the people raise a family with one parent. They're working 2 jobs, $8 and $9 an hour jobs. So you go into that to try to raise the minimum wage. So you have to really follow what I learned in the South, which is to listen to the people, what they really want, and see if you can organize them.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I wish we had all the time in the world, but like I say, maybe we'll find a way to do further interviews, and we could talk even more about some of the work that you've done.
We'll do it again. We'll do some on national TV, as I was going to.
I think so. Yeah.
Right. GBH, will they do it?
We'll see.
Not if the Koch family can prevent it. They'll prevent this, man. I'll tell you right now.
Yeah. Yeah.